Now, as the name of the video implies, this is part 13 of a story, so if you haven't seen any or all of the previous parts, I'd highly recommend starting at part 1 or wherever you left off, and if you like it, working your way back here to this part, or this will make absolutely no sense to you at all. Links to all previous parts can be found in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start by getting a shot of the Senate building on Coruscant, before we're taken inside, into the office of Senator Leia Organa, where she has all but fallen into a chair behind her desk after having been told that she is the sister of Luke Skywalker, and standing behind her, with a comforting hand upon her shoulder, is Han Solo, who looks at the young, red-haired Erebus who has just told Leia this news, and to her he says, "Kid, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." But before he can say more, Leia takes hold of the hand on her shoulder, squeezes it, and with a look both full of shock and acceptance, says, "No, she's telling the truth. I can just feel it." To that, Han makes a disbelieving face, but can't seem to find anything to say. That's when Erebus, who looks slightly surprised by Leia's reaction, shuts her eyes for a moment, concentrates, and says, "I can sense your confusion. You truly didn't know, did you?" Leia flashes her a look, but says nothing to her. Instead, she mutters mostly to herself, "Endor. That's what he was going to tell me on Endor. But why has he never told me in the time since?" That's when Erebus speaks up. "To protect you and your son from Vader, no doubt." Leia glares at her for a moment and then says, "And what would you know of Darth Vader?" For the briefest of moments then, there is a look of pain on Erebus' face, before she says, now with a look of pride upon it, "I am his apprentice, the one he chose to be beside him as he rules this galaxy." To that, Leia rolls her eyes and says, "If what you say is true, and you are Luke's daughter, the only reason he chose you is for your power, to use you. That's what he does. That's what he is." Erebus shakes her head and says, "You don't understand him at all." Leia then fires back, "And clearly neither do you if you think he is anything but the epitome of darkness and evil." Now with a look of anger on her face, Erebus raises the saber in her hand and says, "You could never understand him as I do. Now contact Luke Skywalker and convince him to come here." Leia looks at Erebus for a moment and then folds her arms and says, "To what end?" Erebus replies, "I told you, I wish to speak with my father." Leia thinks for a moment and then gives a bit of a smug grin and says, "Let me guess. Vader recently learned the truth about me, that I'm Luke's sister. He wanted you to then bring Ben to him, his other grandchild, and now you've fallen a bit out of favor. How am I doing so far?" Erebus says nothing to that, but her anger-filled look says it all. Leia then continues, "And now you've come here thinking if you can kill Luke Skywalker, you'll get back in his good graces, that doing that will put things back the way they were before, when, in reality, you already know the truth. You mean nothing to him." With a scream of rage, Erebus reaches out with her free hand, takes hold of Leia through the Force, and lifts her from the chair and flings her back into the window behind her desk, hitting the glass so hard that it cracks. Han immediately frees his trusty DL-44 blaster from its holster and begins to fire at Erebus without so much as a second thought, but she manages to block all the bolts with her lightsaber, and even sends one of them flying back at Han, hitting him somewhere in the stomach, which drops him to the ground, groaning in pain. Erebus, now looking just a little bit crazed, says mostly to herself as she continues to keep Leia pinned to the window, "He couldn't harm me. My grandfather couldn't harm me. He's still in there. Anakin Skywalker is still in there, and I'm going to save him." That's when Han, wincing in pain and pressing his hands to his wound, says, "Kid, you're back in the wrong faith here in this race. Killing Luke won't endear you to Vader. It'll just give him less of a reason to even need you." To that, Erebus shakes her head and pushes Leia harder against the glass, causing it to crack even further. She then says, "We'll soon see about that, won't we?" We then switch scenes and get a shot of Luke, Rey, and Ben emerging from the Sith Temple on Malachor and heading for the small shuttle, when suddenly Luke just stops, shuts his eyes, and looks unsteady upon his feet. Immediately Rey and Ben rush to his side and take hold of his arm to keep him on his feet. Rey then gives Ben a look, as if asking what's wrong with him, but Ben just shrugs helplessly. After another moment or two, Luke then opens his eyes, offers both of them a quick thank you, and says that they have to get to Coruscant immediately. Ben then responds, "It's my parents, isn't it?" Luke sighs, looks like he doesn't want to answer, but then simply nods his head. Ben then says, his eyes suddenly gazing off into the distance at nothing in particular, "It's as if I can feel their fear somehow. Their pain. Luke nods again and then says, "The block I put on you is all but gone, Ben. The Force now flows through you completely." Ben seems to concentrate for a moment, then grimaces in pain before looking at Luke and saying, "She's there too, isn't she? Erebus. She'll kill them if we don't come." But to that, Luke shakes his head and says, "No, not if we don't come. She'll only kill them if I don't come." Ben vigorously shakes his head. "No, I'm coming too." But Luke lays a hand on Ben's shoulder and says, "This is a dangerous time for you, a time when it will be very easy to embrace the darkness that is within you." Ben again shakes his head. "But I don't feel this darkness you speak of." Luke, his expression stern, glances briefly at Rey and then looks in Ben's eyes and says, "Even a fully trained Jedi Master, with their mind clear and focused, can have trouble distinguishing the dark from the light. And you, Ben, have only begun to feel the Force, to understand what that even means. If one does not have the deepest commitment, the most serious mind, they will soon lose their way, as even I did. They will soon let their fear of loss and defeat lead them down the dark path." Ben, his face completely resolute, then says, "I'm not afraid." And at this point, very faintly, we can hear Luke Skywalker say those exact same words to Yoda oh so long ago. And just like Yoda said then, Luke says now, "You will be." Luke then again glances at Rey, then back at Ben and says, "You have everything to lose, Ben, and you can't tell me you wouldn't do whatever it takes to protect her, to protect the ones you care about. Our friends, our family. They've always been, and I fear always will be, the greatest strength and greatest weakness of us Skywalkers." We then switch scenes and find ourselves focused in on one of the eyes of Darth Vader. And as we pull back, we find him seated in his chair-like apparatus in the middle of his vast, dark chamber. And we see that resting in the palm of his hand is the rock that is a piece of the portal to the world between worlds. And it is giving off a brilliant golden glow. And within that glow, we see Anakin and Padme alone together in her apartment on Coruscant. And by the way Anakin looks, with very short hair, it seems to be not long after the Clone Wars has begun. And as we focus in on the scene even closer, we see Anakin is running his hands through his hair, commenting about how strange it is to no longer have his braid, yet how exciting it is to finally be a Jedi. That's when we see, very briefly, a look of sadness and regret cross the face of Padme, a look that Anakin too notices, and he moves forward, wraps her in his arms, and says, "I already told you, my love, once the war is over, I'll leave the Order, and you can leave the Senate, and we can just go and be happy together somewhere, anywhere." Padme holds him tighter when he says this, and now we see only happiness and relief upon her face as she says, "Why did this war have to come to the galaxy in the first place?" Anakin gives a bit of a shrug and then says, "I don't know, but for you, for us, I'll do all I can to end it as quickly as possible." He then pulls back and away from her a bit, flashes her a bit of a cocky grin, and jokingly says, "Even if I have to end it myself somehow." Just then, the doors to Vader's chamber slide open, and as Snoke walks in, Vader wraps his hand around the stone, engulfing it and bringing an end to the golden image. Snoke then says with a snarl as he walks towards him, "Perhaps you should focus a bit more on the present, Vader, on securing a victory over the New Republic and destroying Luke Skywalker, so that we will have the power to open a portal to change your past." Vader then replies, "Most of the New Republic fleet is still scattered across the Outer Rim. What waits for us at Coruscant will be no match for our fleet. And when my troops take the Senate building, when the galaxy sees the hope they fought so hard for destroyed in one quick stroke, they will fall into despair, and the power of the dark side will grow once more. As for Skywalker, if all I have foreseen and planned comes to pass, I will not be the one who has to destroy him." We then switch scenes and find ourselves back in the office of Senator Leia Organa, where Erebus now paces anxiously about the room, while Leia tends to the wounded Han Solo who lays on a sofa. Han then says, with a small grin of fond remembrance upon his face, "This reminds me of Cloud City, where you finally admitted that you loved me, Princess." Leia shakes her head but can't help but give a slight smile before kissing him on the forehead and simply saying, "I know." She then glances up at the pacing Erebus and says quietly to Han, "Problem is, this is just like Cloud City, which means Luke is probably on his way to fight another battle he can't win." To that, Han scoffs and says, "You kidding me? You don't think Luke could take her?" To that, Leia shuts her eyes as if trying to keep her patience. When she opens them, she says, "Have you already forgotten she's his daughter? That he's not going to come here to kill her?" Han thinks for a brief second, then gives an awkward grin and says, "Right, forgot. Having trouble keeping all this family relations stuff straight. Like the fact I married Darth Vader's daughter." To that, Leia frowns and says, "You're not the only one having issues coming to terms with that." Just then, a beeping sound comes from Leia's desk, and instantly Erebus halts her pacing and only says, "It's him." She then looks at Leia and commands, "Make sure he's on his way here." Leia grumbles something about not needing to be told to make sure Luke is on his way, considering him and the rest of his Jedi will be needed against the Imperial fleet that's likely on its way. And then, when she reaches her desk, she hits a button and a small blue holographic image of Luke Skywalker appears, and immediately the two speak at the same time, and Luke asks if she's okay, while Leia asks if Ben is okay. They both then answer each other at the same time, Leia only saying she's okay, which draws a frown from Han for him and his wound not being mentioned, and Luke saying that Ben is fine and safe with him. And it's at this point that the two stop, smile at each other, and seem to share a moment. Luke then says, "I'm sorry, Leia," to which Leia responds, "For which part exactly?" Luke gives a bit of a chuckle and says, "For all of it." Leia smiles back briefly and then says, "I trust you're on your way?" To which Luke replies, "Did you really have to ask?" Leia smirks, then says, "What about the rest of the Jedi?" To that Luke says, "The Jedi will fight alongside the Republic once more, Leia, and if I'm right, the Empire will try to take the Senate building. We'll help reinforce you there." Leia nods in agreement to that and says, "They'll try to take the Senate to break the spirit of the New Republic. I agree." Luke then says, "Speaking of the Senate and the Republic, what's your status there?" At this point, Leia glances up at Erebus before saying, "Some of the senators have fled, fearing imminent attack. Those who stayed can't seem to agree on anything and are stuck in deliberations about what to do. Most of the New Republic's fleet is still in the Outer Rim awaiting new orders, or so the Senate and hopefully the Empire believes." Luke looks confused by this, so Leia answers his unspoken question. "General Syndulla is in command of the Outer Rim Task Force, and, well, I may have suggested she gather up her fleet and return home without Senate's approval, which, by any luck, she'll be here before the Empire." We then switch scenes and get a shot of Darth Vader's Super Star Destroyer flying through hyperspace before we're taken on board and into a large hangar bay where we see row after row of tall, imposing-looking troopers clad in bulky black Imperial armor. And walking amongst their ranks are the Kaminoan Dr. Search, Grand Admiral Versio, and Director Hux. And we hear Versio say as she stops and looks over one of the unmoving troopers, "Impressive. You should be commended for your service to the Empire." At hearing this, Hux smiles from ear to ear, but that's when Grand Admiral Versio quickly says, "I was speaking to Dr. Search." Hux snarls at that, which Versio ignores, and then she looks at Dr. Search and says, "And you were saying their armor even acts as a type of dropship?" Dr. Search gives an all-too-pleased grin and says, "It does indeed. They can be dropped anywhere from low orbit, and once on the ground they make a formidable foe for any opponent. Even a Jedi will find both their armor and skin underneath very resilient to lightsaber attacks." Versio nods in approval and then asks, "Speaking of Jedi, any success in making these creations of yours force-sensitive?" Dr. Search gives a bit of a frown and says, "Very little, I'm afraid. For years, thanks to Lord Sidious, I had plenty of Jedi subjects to experiment upon, but the only results they yielded, much to his and my own dismay, is that the Force is rather unpredictable. Cloning a Jedi doesn't produce a Force-sensitive clone, I fear. What makes someone strong with the Force seems to be the result of something else entirely, something I've yet been able to discover." Versio then nods in understanding and says, "Nevertheless, impressive work, Doctor, and soon your creations will storm the Senate building and help restore the Empire to its rightful place." And with that, Versio and Hux continue walking, while for a moment, Dr. Search just stands there. The expression on his face is one of a being who is somehow both pleased and horrified by what he has done. We then switch scenes and find ourselves with Luke, Ben, and Rey aboard the small shuttle as it flies through hyperspace, and we see that Luke is talking to a small blue image of Jacen Syndulla, who we hear saying, "My apologies, Master Skywalker, but I'm way ahead of you. I and the rest of the Jedi are already on our way to Coruscant. In your absence, and in the absence of Rad, I took it upon myself to make the call after Senator Organa and my mother, General Syndulla, contacted me." Luke nods upon hearing this and then says, "You made the right decision, Jason. Though, it troubles me to hear that Varad has gone missing." Jason nods and says, "It troubles me as well, Master, and if I may say, I always got a strange feeling from him. I'm not sure where you found him, but I always just sensed there was something different about him." Luke frowns when he hears this and then says, "When you reach Coruscant, your main priority is to work with the New Republic forces to secure the Senate building, but under no circumstances are you to seek out Senator Organa, no matter what you may sense when you get there." Jason looks confused to hear this, and like he wants to ask more, but instead just nods once and says, "Of course, I understand, Master Skywalker." The blue image of Jason Syndulla fades away, and Luke leans back in his seat looking more troubled than ever. That's when Ben, who sits in the co-pilot seat next to him, notices the look and says, "Now what's wrong?" Luke only says the name, Varad. Ben, very much confused, then says, "Your Padawan, the one you arrived on Coruscant with not long ago when you met with my mother." Luke, looking very much lost in thought, only nods, and Ben then says, "So, he's gone missing?" Luke sighs and then says, "So it would seem." Ben is quiet for a moment, like he doesn't think it's his place to ask, but then does anyway. "Why does that trouble you so much?" Luke shuts his eyes and then says, "Because I was hoping he would be an ally against Vader. Now I fear he may be an ally of Vader's. And to say that's going to complicate things is a great understatement." To that, Ben nods as if he completely understands, then hesitantly says, "If that's true, then you're going to need all the help you can get, right? Which is all the more reason to let me fight at your side." Luke looks at Ben and then says, "A Jedi's last resort is to fight, Ben. Besides, to be blunt, you'd likely only get in the way." Ben looks hurt for a moment, but then Luke grins at him and says, "If you're going to come with me, Ben, then your one and only task will be getting your parents to safety. That's it. There'll be no fighting for you." To that, Ben responds, "I understand." We then switch scenes and get a shot of the planet Coruscant, where we now see around 15 large New Republic warships drop out of hyperspace, and we're then taken to the bridge of one of those ships, to the largest of them, a ship that we recognize as the Radis, and see General Hera Syndulla standing there, looking out a view screen at the bustling city planet below, and at her side is Chopper. One of the other bridge officers then calls out, "General, incoming communication, but ma'am, they're asking to speak with a Spectre too?" To that, Hera grins and tells them to put it through, which is when a life-sized blue image of Sabine Wren materializes in front of Hera on the bridge, and to it she says, "Spectre 5, glad you could join us." Sabine then replies, "Don't thank me just yet, Hera. I could only convince a few of the houses to go along with this. The last thing most of them want is for Mandalore to get tangled up with the Empire again." Hera nods in understanding and then says, "Well, those Mandalorians who have chosen to fight alongside us this day have my gratitude, and the gratitude of the whole New Republic. A victory this day could go a long way in finally securing a long-lasting alliance between us." Sabine nods in agreement, then says, "You're forgetting the if we win part. Our reconnaissance says the Imperial fleet is massive, at least twice the size of what will be combined." Hera gives a single nod of the head and says, "Our reconnaissance says the same, I'm afraid. But do I have to remind you, Spectre 5, of the odds we faced last time we fought the Empire, and yet we still won?" Sabine grins and says, No, you don't have to remind me. I still remember all too well." At this point, a loud alarm sounds and everybody on the bridge turns and looks at the view screen, and we now see a massive Super Star Destroyer emerge from hyperspace right above Coruscant, and it's followed by many, many other smaller Star Destroyers that immediately open fire on the New Republic fleet. As from the Super Star Destroyer, we see dozens upon dozens of small objects being launched from the ship down towards the planet. We then hear Sabine ask, "Is that what I think it is?" Hera nods and says, "It is. They're here, and there's even more of them than we expected." Sabine then says, "Hold tight, we'll be there soon." And the image of Sabine flickers and fades away. And a moment later, it is replaced by an image of Jason Syndulla that Hera looks upon half like a proud yet worried parent and half like a general who is doing her duty. Hera then says to him, "You've got incoming, Jason. Small dropships of some kind, like nothing I've ever seen out of the Empire before." Jason then replies, "Well, we'll be ready for him. And Mom, may the Force be with you." Hera then says back, "May the Force be with you too." And after the image of Jason flickers and fades away, Hera mutters, "Kanan, watch over him, please." We then get a series of scenes and images. First in space, we see the Star Destroyers launch perhaps 1,000 TIE fighters that swarm the New Republic fleet and the half-dozen Mandalorian vessels that soon arrive, and are led by Sabine and a grizzled and very old-looking Mandalorian who goes only by the name Rikamani. The New Republic quickly counters by launching X-Wings, both from the ships in the fleet and from the planet below, but they are greatly outnumbered, and for some time, we watch as they trade fire and ships, which is a problem considering the New Republic is outnumbered by at least a 2-to-1 margin. Down on Coruscant, in the now flaming Senate building, we watch as Jacen Syndulla, along with some 24 Jedi and a well-armed and well-trained New Republic defense fighting force, take on the large yet quick and rather nimble troopers that were a result of Dr. Search's Star Commander program. And, one by one, we watch as the Jedi fall, and watch as the New Republic defenders get decimated by the monstrosities that wield a variety of different weapons. But despite their losses, and the fact that they are very resilient to lightsabers, the Jedi and other defenders have been able to fell a great many of the large troopers, until only maybe 24 or so of them remain. But now, unfortunately, all that remains of the defenders is Jacen Syndulla and one other Jedi, a Zabrak female, and they stand back to back as the troopers begin to surround them. The two Jedi then look over their shoulders at each other, give a bit of a nod as if to say both goodbye and let's do this already, and then they charge at the troopers, letting out one final battle cry. Soon enough though, the Zabrak is cut down, but Jacen manages to take down 2 more of the large troopers, one right after the other, and then he climbs upon the back of one of the fallen troopers and awaits the attacks of all the others who have now completely encircled him and close ranks on him quickly. And the look on Jacen's face is one of a man who knows he is about to die, but doesn't plan on doing it quietly. Back in space above Coruscant now, we quickly see that most of the New Republic fleet has been destroyed, as have most of the Mandalorian ships, while most of the Imperial fleet is still very much intact and picking off what remains. We're then taken to the bridge of the Radis, which is being rocked by laser fire, and see Hera standing there, still barking out orders at her officers when suddenly a blue holographic image of an individual of some sort begins to form on the bridge, but the Radis has either sustained too much damage or there is too much interference, for the holographic figure is distorted and impossible to make out. But the voice comes through crystal clear and says, "General Syndulla, might we offer you some assistance?" Hera's eyes go wide when she hears that, and at the same time, Chopper lets loose a string of beeps and whistles that are, as usual, impossible to make out but don't sound too positive or optimistic. That's when Hera says to herself, "That voice, I'll never forget that voice." And it is then that the holographic image comes into focus, and we see that it is Thrawn. We're then taken back outside the ship, into space, and see a couple dozen Chiss vessels come out of hyperspace and begin to fire upon the Imperials. We're then taken back down to Coruscant, into the Senate building, where an exhausted-looking Jacen Syndulla is making his final stand. And just when one of the troopers is about to bring some type of bladed energy weapon down on him from behind, it freezes in place. In fact, all 24 or so of the troopers freeze completely, and that's when a flabbergasted Jacen Syndulla begins to look all around him, trying to figure out what's going on. When he spots, just outside the circle of troopers, stands Luke Skywalker, with his eyes closed and his arm extended out with his hand open. And ever so slowly then, Luke begins to close that hand, and as he does, he begins to tremble, and at the same time, we start to hear the sound of metal being crushed, and notice that the armor of the troopers is slowly crumbling in upon itself, and as it does, we hear the horrible, pain-filled screams of the monstrous creatures within as they're crushed to death. When done, Luke is about to collapse to the floor when, seemingly from out of nowhere, Ben and Rey rush forward to catch him. Jacen then hops down from the back of the trooper he was standing upon, and, looking completely awed, yet still exhausted, moves towards Luke and bows once he reaches him and says, "I would have never imagined such power could be achieved through the Force." Luke, seemingly getting some of his strength back, gives a nod to Rey and Ben, assuring them that he's okay, and they both let him go and back away. Luke then says to Jacen, "As I've told you many times in your training, the Force is capable of anything. All we do is either have the selfless nobility to let it work through us, or the indomitable will to corrupt it for our own means." Jason nods to that and seems to quietly self-berate himself for letting himself get caught up in the moment at the incredible feat that Luke, or rather the Force through Luke, has just managed. That's when we hear the sound of clapping echoing all around them and see moving out from around one of the husks of the crushed troopers, and coming into view is Erebus Skywalker, giving Luke a rather mocking-sounding round of applause. She then says, "How impressive. The great Luke Skywalker lives up to the legend, it would seem." Quickly and quietly then, Luke says to Jason Syndulla, "Go, help anyone and everyone you can, and check on our fellow Jedi. I feel some of them may yet live, but are gravely wounded." Jason takes one long look at Erebus, who smiles at him as he does, before he then runs off. Luke then says to Ben and Rey, "Find your parents, Ben, and get them out of here. Don't think or worry about anything else. Do you understand?" Ben sighs, also glares at Erebus for a moment, before nodding his head in, with Rey in tow, running off in the direction of Leia's office. Once they're all gone, Luke then says, "I'm sorry I failed you and your mother, Erebus. I would try to explain it all to you, to let you know I never even knew you existed, that I was blinded by the dark side all this time. But you don't want to hear any of that, do you?" Erebus nods a bit, takes a hold of her lightsaber and says, "You're right, I don't." Luke then says, as his eyes narrow on Erebus and he concentrates a bit, "You want to destroy me, to prove yourself to him, to Vader, don't you? But there's more." Luke seems to concentrate a bit harder, and then he says, "You want to prove something to yourself, too." Erebus then ignites her saber and cries out, "Silence! Stay out of my head. You've long since lost any right to lecture me, father." Being called father seems to sting Luke, and the regret is plain on his face as he says, "You should know, I will not fight you." To that, Erebus only smiles and replies, "Good, then this will be easier than I expected." And with those words, she charges at Luke. And that is how this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part and how you think it'll end next week. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.